capacity as deputy team leader for the Mekong Region Land Governance Project, a project that covers 4 countries and also inspired himself from Thailand. And welcome to the launch of the State of Land in the Mekong region, the book that I hope you have picked up at the entrance. So today we are welcoming many guests here from Chiang University, who is kindly hosting us, and from other parts of Thailand. Some have traveled this morning very early, I guess, to be here with us. We are welcoming, I suppose, a few students, researchers, some practitioners, both from governments and from the civil society. And I think that's very nice because we have a very diverse group, and that should be very interesting for our discussion later in the day. To start with, I would like to introduce to you the guest speakers of today. We have here the co-editor and the lead author of The State of Land, Dr. Micah Ingalls. He is a senior research scientist from the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Bern in Switzerland. And he will present to us the book and share with us some key findings. We have also Daniel Hayward, who is the coordinator of the Mekong Land Research Forum here at the Chiang Mai University. He has been particularly involved in the writing of the chapter related to Thailand, with the assistance from Ms. Virakan Kenkat. We are also lucky to have with us, for leading a discussion on the book, Assistant Professor Mr. Chusak Vitayapa from Chiang Mai University. And that will be for this morning. And I hope to hear also for all the other people present with questions and remarks. And this afternoon we will have another group of guest speakers who will bring the perspective on land and inequality in Thailand. We will have first Mr. Kitisak Ratanakransi, who is the chairperson of the Asian Indigenous People Pact, and he will offer us a perspective from the civil society. We will have Mr. Lee Ayu Chupa, the co-founder of Aka Amakofi, for a private sector perspective, and Mr. Apivat Ratanabaraha from Chulalongkorn University for a more academic perspective on this topic. And I think that should really broaden our scope for a larger discussion. So welcome to everyone. And by the way of a brief introduction, just a few words on the state of lands, to make it short. This book is the result of a collaboration between CDE, so the Center for Development and Environment, and the Mekong Region Land Governance Project, MRLG. In this respect, The State of Lands is a seminal publication. A key objective of this book is to bring together and present key data and information on the current status and trajectory of change with regard to land resource, the social distribution, and the condition of governance that shape land across the Mekong region. Today we are in Thailand, and we may have a deeper look on this country, but the perspective of this book is very much comparative and to have a regional perspective. We are convinced that while each of the countries of the region have fundamental socio-political and historical difference and specificities, they all have much to learn from each other, especially in their experience in governance in the land sector. The way they have regulated and they are regulating access to land and natural resource. In many ways, the challenge that they are facing are similar. So key issues that are documented in the books are not specific to one country, but go across several countries, such as the dramatic transformation of agriculture and land tenure system, the acceleration of land-based investment, the migration, the growing inequality between smallholder farmers and other producers, agribusinesses, the persistence of rural communities within forest areas without appropriate and secure rights, the problems of encroachment into protected areas that is increasing across the region. So these issues are not specific to any one country. We can find them in the different countries, and I think that the purpose of this book is really to try to allow for some comparison and cross-learning. Though for Thailand, through its own trajectory and over a century of policymaking and building land institutions, Thailand provides a very rich example of policies related to agrarian transitions and dealing with land issues that have emerged through these transitions. I think that's an experience that may inspire other governments and non-government institutions in neighboring countries, and they are really looking at, I believe, to what Thailand experience. And many of the challenges they deal with today are challenges that Thailand has been dealing with for over several decades now. So that's the perspective of the book. We will hear much more from the speakers and the authors of the book. I would like to invite all of you to participate to the discussion, bring up your questions and concern. I think beyond a book that you can bring back home, and I do invite you to take one of several copies if you know some people who are interested by this book. If you have a library in your own university where you can put this book, please ask for more copies. And beyond reading this book at home, I think what is very interesting is to generate the discussion that we will have today, that we had in other countries and we will continue to have. And from this debate, I think there are many issues that and questions that we should learn from, and that we could also look deeper in the future endeavor in terms of research. So it's my wish today that you find the launch informative, insightful, and inspirational. As together we rise to the challenge of improving land governance in the Mekong region and ensure the land tenure security of smallholder farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Delanier. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Ajahn Shayan from the RCSD to give his opening remarks.
Good morning and very warm welcome to all of the participants of this book launching event, and thank you very much for a very nice welcoming speech by Tuan Delinier, telling us about the beauty of the book and the ideas behind making this book available for researchers, students, and NGO workers. On behalf of the Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development, I'm very pleased to be part of this event, and also very grateful for having a chance to work with MRLG in the last 4 or 5 years. RCSD has been established since 1998, and the main focus of our regional center is to understand the drastic transformation in the region, particularly the upper mainland Southeast Asia. As you may remember, after 1992, when ADB announced this plan for the Greater Mekong sub-region, we thought that the regional integration will leave both positive and negative impacts upon local community, particularly natural resources. So during the first 10 years of our activities at RCSD, we focus on resource management, particularly on the issue of forest management. So the ideas of community forest, land, customary right among local people, indigenous knowledge in forest protection have been the major focus of our center, both our faculty members, students, and researchers. Right? We also work with university in the region and also provide some scholarship and research fellowship to students and scholars from the region. So in the last 10 years after the first attempt, we thought that besides forest, land has become much more important issue. And we, of course, with the support from MRLG, we have received a number of scholarships to support students from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, except Thailand, because Thailand was not on the list on that. And in the last 4 or 5 years, 3 years, we have started a kind of a land specialization, like a cluster within our program, with the help of MRLG. And of course, Daniel has been the major, the driver of this land cluster in our program. So we hope that these collaborations should continue. And this year we have received four scholarships to support students from the region as well, from Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Vietnam as well this year. Cambodia. I just want to point out to some opportunity and also challenges. What I'm showing you is what they call platform, the 4 platform recently issued by the new Ministry of Higher Education, Science and Innovation in Thailand. So most of us now are very busy with how to interpret these platforms given from the new ministry and from the university. How should we conceptualize our research project in response to the call from the Ministry of the new Ministry of Higher Education, Science and Innovation. So they divided their policy into 4 areas or platforms. The first one is grand challenges, and here they put the word inequality there. ความเหลื่อมล้ำ I don't know in Laos what do you say? Same? ความเหลื่อมล้ำ. This is the good news that because it is first time that the national policy, Thai national policy, emphasizes upon inequality, which is the most important issue, I would argue, in Thailand. But if you look at other platforms, the emphasis on innovation, they are interested in developing innovation, bioscience, green, what they call the green economy or circular economy. But in the policy, nothing mentioned about resource, neither land issue. It's not talking about land issue at all. So why this is the opportunity that the national policy emphasizes upon inequality in Thailand. But at the same time, it does not mention about land issue or resource issue. So I think the book that we are launching today, I hope it would provide an input in ideas and inspiration for researchers, our students, and those who are interested in working on inequality, how we can link the issue of land to inequality. Particularly, if you look at the chapter back on Thailand, on smallholders in Thailand and inequality. We are not talking about the large landholder in Thailand, but smallholder, and particularly those who live in the forest. I am sorry that I will not be able to attend all the activities today because on the other room I'm supposed to meet with another group of NGO. We are planning to have a seminar on what is called how to bring this cabinet resolution on the special culture zone, how this cabinet resolution, which was issued 9 years ago, but so far it has not been implemented concretely. They're just only cabinet resolution. These supposed to give a protection or respecting the customary land practices, land tenure system. Here in Thailand, we do not talk about ancestor domain yet because Thailand do not recognize the concept of indigenous people. But this cabinet resolution may be another way to protect the customary land tenure system among the ethnic minorities in Thailand, particularly in northern Thailand. Right? So I would like to use this opportunity to thank MRLG for organizing the book on state of land, mobilizing resources, inviting scholars to write interesting paper on the state of the land in the region, not only in Thailand, but in the overall in region. And I hope that this can be used for, not only for our teaching in our program, but also ideas to help us to understand the complexity of land issues in the region and to find ways to understand more about this and seek further collaboration among different parties, different actors and stakeholders in the region. And I hope that this is not only to be the first and the last one, but I hope that we would have this opportunity in the future to meet and to discuss, have more time to talk about this issue in the future. Thank you, all of you who come here, and I hope that we can look for another opportunity to engage more systematically about land issue in the region. Thank you very much.
Good morning. With apologies, I'm afraid I'll present in English. I guess most people can follow. I should also apologize in advance that I tend to speak quickly. These topics are very exciting. I will, however, endeavor to keep it slow. So as Ajahn Chayan mentioned, and Bobby also introduced, I will be speaking first as sort of an overview at the regional level for this. Subsequent to which Daniel will present more specifically about those aspects for Thailand. First, by way of introducing the various contributors and authors and donors of this. This information is also found in the beginning parts of the book. So if you want to look into detail, we should, of course, especially thank those donors. So SDC, German government, and the government of Luxembourg. The state of land is organized around sort of core domains of information. So the idea was to assess the land resource base across the Mekong countries, so Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam, and then to assess how that resource base has changed over time with respect to land uses, land covers, agricultural purposes, and others, and then how that resource is distributed across society. So here especially focusing on smallholders, but also looking at other things like large-scale land acquisitions, concessions, special economic zones, et cetera. And then in the context of these, the next section of the book deals with tenure security. So not only formalization through titling and other forms, but also other ways in which tenure security, here again, focusing primarily on smallholders, can be ensured, and sort of the current status of it. And then lastly was an assessment more generally of the conditions of land governance in the region. So rule of law, transparency, access to justice, conflicts, grievance mechanisms. The book is organized then through a regional overview, and then there are specific chapters dealing with each country, following more or less the same structure. So first, the land and the people. So here focusing on the people who are using the land and this resource. What's interesting about the Mekong region, as many people know, is that still, despite urbanization and development, it's still predominantly rural in terms of the population. Thailand is the only country where slightly less than half the population is considered rural. But for most of the rest of the Mekong, it's still largely a rural place. If you look at the sub-national level, so these first figures show the percent, the proportion at the national level. Subnationally, the picture is quite different. I think what is interesting is that in terms of comparison across the different Mekong countries, the differences between countries in the Mekong is generally less than the differences at the subnational level within each of the Mekong countries. So Thailand, where more than half the population is no longer considered rural, still there are places where there's a high degree of rurality, which is interesting, I think, when we think about comparative analyses within the country. Here again, what's interesting about this is that we have both a large rural population, and also there remains a high degree of poverty in many places. So here again, what's interesting is that Thailand has the lowest poverty rate in the region, which I think we'd expect. But if you look again at the number of poor persons versus the proportion of the population, Thailand has more poor people than all of Laos and Cambodia combined because of its large population size. So while having the lowest rate of poverty, it still has a very large number of poor persons, almost 5 million. Here again, what's interesting is if we compare degree of rurality and poverty rates, most of the poor in the region are rural, not urban. So I think when we're thinking about land resources and smallholders and such, what's quite significant is there's a very close correlation between rurality and poverty rates. The areas that have generally, so here are a couple of examples, 90% of the poor in Cambodia are rural. In Thailand, less than half the population is rural, but 80% of those considered poor are rural versus urban persons. So there's this high degree of disproportionality between where poverty is occurring and where urbanization is happening. That's here, I think it's quite clear if you look at the subnational. These white patches, which show very low poverty rates, more or less correspond with Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Vientiane, Bangkok in the central area, and then Yangon in the central area. So I think what we're finding is that development in the Mekong region has progressed very rapidly in urban areas with reductions in poverty, but very much slower in rural areas, which is significant when we talk, again, as Ajahn Chayan mentioned, about inequality and how this is featuring in society now. Now here again, looking at changes that have occurred, Thailand is interesting in that Thailand's proportion of agriculture in its GDP has not changed much in the past number of years. So this is looking at the past 10 years. But in the other countries, the Mekong has changed very rapidly. So generally speaking, in the last 10 years, agriculture, though the sector itself has grown much more slowly than other sectors like industry, manufacturers, services, in some countries very drastically, meaning that agriculture is having an increasingly smaller role, less important role in the economies of the country, and yet still the majority of the population is involved in it. So what that means is that the sector that supports the largest proportion of the population is that sector which is relatively is shrinking relative to the other sectors. And here again, I think this relates closely to what we're seeing with poverty and rurality and such. Now here, the land resource base. So this shows a map basically of land uses and land covers across the Mekong region. Looking at changes across those, I think here, as we'd expect, there's been continued deforestation and continued growth of agricultural land. So while the sector's proportional contribution to GDP decreases, the land area it takes up is still increasing significantly. But in the past 20 years, then about 9 million hectares of agricultural land have been added. Here you find what's interesting. So Myanmar and Cambodia have had the largest deforestation rates. So the bottom color green there indicates forest cover. So in both of those countries, we have continued to see rapid declines in forest area, increasing agricultural area. Whereas in countries like Lao PDR and Vietnam, the forest area has increased in both of those countries. It's important to note, though, when we talk about forest and forest cover, I think, as many of you know, the definitions used are quite significant here. So increases in forest area in Laos and Vietnam are arguably more attributable to the growth in industrial tree plantations, not natural forest. So largely this means rubber, acacia, and other industrial trees or commercial tree species that are considered to be forest by the definitions. So here I think one thing that's quite important in all this in the transition toward larger agricultural areas in general has been the role that the so-called boom crops have been playing. And these are crops that have had, typically they're very closely linked to global market systems. They're crops that have had a very rapid increase in the past number of years, which is why boom crops. Most important to these really are sugarcane, oil palm, cassava, maize, and rubber. There are for sure other crops, and they're quite fluid and changing over time, less so for the stationary crops like rubber, but for others. Here what we did to sort of assess then the impact of boom crops, but also crops more generally, was to calculate a crop diversity index. So the crop diversity index is a composite looking at the number of crops and their proportional area within the total agricultural space. What you find here is interesting. 0 would be hypothetically no diversity, so it would be all land area comprising of one single crop species, whereas 1 in the CDI would mean a total diversity. So those are both hypothetical numbers. Therefore, in reality, everything falls mostly between a 0 and 1. Thailand has had the second most diverse area in terms of crop diversity, and a lot of this is related to its commercialization that's become quite diversified across many different crop species. Other countries, it's relatively lower. But here again, if you look at the subnational level, it's again a slightly different picture. And what we find, actually back a little bit, is you look at this sort of central region, whereas the main rice growing regions, that's where diversity is lowest. So basically here along the central sort of breadbasket region, as you say, in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam in the Delta. The crop diversity index, what we found was that it was most heavily influenced by the boom crops and the role that they played. If you take together, so in the Mekong region, about 50% of all agricultural land is rice because of its preeminent role in food subsistence and other things. If you add to the area of rice, the area of those other 5 boom crops we mentioned, so rubber, maize, cassava, oil palm, whichever one I just forgot, together those comprise 80% of all agricultural land. And I think that was something that surprised us, but I think is quite significant too, as we think about diversity and its relationship to adaptive capacity, climate change, and things like this. What we find is that the Mekong region, and especially Thailand, is highly dependent upon a very limited number of crop species. Here we also then look at the distribution of those crops. And I think you find more or less what you would. Thailand plays a very lead role in many of these crops, but also there's a lot of rubber and other things in Cambodia and in Laos and in Vietnam. The details of this I think might be interesting. So if you are interested, please do have a look at the book where we go into greater detail about kind of how these areas are spatially distributed across the region. Now looking again at, so the land resource base is like this, changing in these certain ways, but now looking at how this is distributed across society. This shows average land holdings, where again, Thailand is in the lead with the largest average land holding. This looks only at smallholder land holdings, not at large corporations or concessions. Thailand has slightly over 3 hectares per person, according to census data. Whereas countries like Vietnam, where agriculture is very intensive, then it's much less than 1 hectare per person. What we did then to look at this, not just the average holdings per person, but then how holdings vary across society. So then taking the total agricultural land area of the country, and then looking at the parcel sizes owned by individual farmers. So this data comes from agricultural census information from each of the countries. And so from this, we computed a Gini index. So you may be familiar with the Gini index used for income. So often we use this as a measure of equality and inequality across society with respect to income and financial distribution. So here we did the same calculation, but looking instead at land holdings and how equal or unequal land holdings are. So here again, 0 means totally equal. So everyone has the exact same amount of area of land, whereas 1 is the hypothetically most unequal situation. Here, Vietnam emerges as the most unequal with 0.54, but Thailand isn't too far behind with 0.49. So here again, looking at just at smallholder holdings. So you take as an example using Vietnam, what 0.54 here means as a Gini index score is that the top 10% of smallholder farmers, landholders, they control 40% of all agricultural land in the country. So here again, if you look at the subnational distribution, it varies significantly in countries. For example, Laos has the lowest, so the greatest equality in terms of land distribution at the national level, but at the subnational level, some of the most unequal areas are also in Laos. So you look here in Pong Sili in the north of Laos. So then looking at the distribution of land, this previous slide shows what we do with smallholder land and how that's distributed. But a big issue for many countries, not so much Thailand, but especially Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, is the role of state land concessions in the country, or large-scale land acquisitions, we sometimes say. These are mostly, at present, they are mostly under the control of foreign companies. So especially China plays a major role in the region, but also Vietnam. Thailand is also a major holder of concessions in Laos and Cambodia, and also in Myanmar to a degree. So here looks at then, this is specifically, these dots represent agriculture and forestry concessions across the region for which we have data. So this is looking, the color, each of these, the color corresponds to the origin of the investor. So in Laos and Cambodia, that data is quite clear through the various concession inventories that we've worked on. Domestic concessions are important. Then China and Vietnam are the largest in terms of area. So here again, the book will provide more detail for that, which might be interesting to you. The size of the dot corresponds to the land area under that concession. For Myanmar, we have the concession data for areas and projects, but not the ownership in terms of where that came from, thus the black. Agriculture and forestry concessions comprise slightly more than 4 million hectares. These are known concessions across the region. If you then add to this mining concessions, which are a much larger area, greater than 10 million, my suspicion is that it's much greater than 10 million because while we have concession information for Myanmar for agriculture and forestry sectors, we do not for mining, and yet we know that mining is a dominant sector for concessions in Myanmar at the present. But most of these are controlled under the military. If you take all of these concession areas together, that's equivalent to about 26% of the total agricultural land of the Mekong region, which is non-trivial, right? It's quite a large amount of area we're talking about. Here again, I think it was interesting. So the previous map that you saw relates to the measure of inequality of distribution of land by smallholders. If you then recompute that, but looking now at smallholders plus concession areas for agriculture and forestry specifically, then the picture changes quite significantly. Thailand has not been heavily involved as a recipient of concessions or granting concessions, so its value doesn't change much, whereas other countries where concessions are high change considerably. So Laos now becomes quite unequal, and Cambodia especially becomes highly unequal. All right, now looking at land tenure security, I think just briefly, we looked then at the total number of parcels in the country owned by smallholders, and then the proportion of those that were covered by formal land titles or other kinds of formalization for tenure security. Again, Thailand and Vietnam are quite high. Myanmar is surprisingly high, but let me get to it. Lao Pierre ranks very low, where land title coverage for agricultural land only, this looks at, in Laos is only about 3%, so it's actually quite low. And that's for some historic reasons. Cambodia, again, is high, but I think what's important here is this measures those lands which are eligible for land titles. So each government defines this differently according to the law. Countries that are high, I raise example probably of Myanmar, where according to official government information, about 90% of eligible agricultural parcels have titles. But eligibility criteria in Myanmar is very, very restrictive, such that a large proportion of land is not considered eligible, and thus this sort of gives an inflated view of the degree of tenure security. So I think probably, as most of you know anyway, using title coverage as a direct measure for tenure security, of course, is kind of a weak measure because of these kinds of restrictions. And also, of course, titles can be revoked in the cases of land concessions, et cetera. And then forest lands is a big issue. So I think what we found is that, again, probably not surprising, the majority of areas that were not covered by land titles generally fell within forest areas, especially state-held forest areas. This is especially true in Laos, also true in Thailand as well, and Myanmar with the virgin forest lands. And in Laos, recently the government has determined that all state forest land, which covers about 61% of the country, is not eligible for titling, despite the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of parcels inside those areas. Then again, so there are other kinds of ways, especially formal legal protections for customary tenure without title, that can help make up this gap and sort of nuance this view of land titling coverage and tenure security. Then also we looked specifically at gendered land. So now it's taking again the data we have on land titling coverage, but looking at the proportion of those land titles which are female, male, or conjugal, so being both the husband and the wife, in terms of coverages, trying to assess sort of equality with respect to gender and tenure security. Here again, Vietnam ranks quite high with a high proportion of the wife and husband's names both on the land titles, and it varies otherwise by country. And then lastly, so this is the part of the assessment that I think was a little bit more, not subjective is not the word, but I think what we're trying to sort of grapple with is how do you go about measuring or assessing conditions of governance over land resources. So we did this through sort of a rubric-based approach where we convened a large meeting of experts in total across the region, more than 200 experts in land-related aspects. So this included civil society, academia, government representation, in some cases multilaterals, international organizations working on this. And we tried to do them with sort of assess against different criteria of where the country stood with respect to its governance conditions over land. We did this sort of mapped out, and again, you can see in the book where we tried to graphically represent this, how the country governance conditions relate to things like legal recognition of tenure, inclusivity in decision-making, protection of ethnic minorities or indigenous peoples, and other aspects in that. I think probably just taking a few of the takeaway messages from that, this is my final slide. One of the things we found across all the countries in the region is a very large gap between policy and practice. Here again, I don't think this is especially surprising, but what you find is that if you assess sort of the formal legal provisions with respect to these things, many of the countries would otherwise, I think, score fairly high in terms of legal provisions and frameworks and processes. But when it comes to actually implementing these, many of the countries fall short, many countries very short of implementing these effectively. Corruption, of course, is a big issue. Formalization of land tenure rights, again, as mentioned above, in some cases formalization has been quite comprehensive, but it is highly restricted with respect to those lands that the state deems eligible for formalization through such things as titles. Indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities are typically recognized in some form. So some countries recognize indigenous peoples formally. Other countries use other ways of handling this, like ethnic minorities. And in some countries, there are specifics. For example, Cambodia, there are specific provisions for indigenous peoples, whereas other countries say that by law we respect the rights and protections for all ethnicities, irrespective of dominance. But nevertheless, in all countries across the region, ethnic minorities tend to disproportionately receive the impacts and costs of changes like large-scale land acquisitions and tend to be inadequately protected and poverty rates tend to decrease at a much lower rate in ethnic minority areas than in dominant ethnic areas. I think here again, sort of looking at current situation, but also toward the future, land investments, and I think especially special economic zones, are continuing to be an issue and probably will be an issue far into the future, especially with special economic zones. I think as we're seeing increasing Chinese investment across the region, that this sort of model of offshoring economic investments and moderating flows of production and trade and such is becoming more and more significant. And here again, there's a lack of transparency and management of these. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ingalls. Daniel, would you like to say a few words now?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's really fantastic to see such a range of different people coming today from different fields and making the effort to travel up from around the country. So I'm very honored that you could all come to make it today to this book launch and seminar. Thank you very much to Antoine and Micah and Ajahn Chayan for the lead up to this more specialist presentation for Thailand. A lot here will echo and maybe pinpoint down more specifically from the regional perspective that Micah has just provided. So I guess the aim here is that what the book is, I think, does marvelously well is provide a wonderful layout of data to kind of give a regional and country specific frame, whereby hopefully you will be able to take this all on into your own perhaps more specified work. And the aim today, what I will not be presenting is case study examples, but I'm hoping that the discussions this afternoon and the presentations will be doing that in the context of land and inequality. But what I hope I can do is still provide a kind of narrative to look at land in Thailand through this data representation. So let's see how that goes. I won't try and cover everything in the chapter, otherwise you won't go away and read it yourselves. So just kind of pick out some of the main features as part of this narrative I would like to present. And hopefully, actually, certainly for some of the most current issues, I fully welcome comments and questions at a later moment from all our other experts in the room who can help kind of elaborate on some of the topics. So I'm very looking forward to having your own perspectives as well. I think the title is very apt, Smallholder Security or Structural Inequality. One of the main themes we will have going along is, are we talking about a sense of stability in Thailand, or are there significant changes still taking place in the land system or land governance? In order to get to that, I guess there are three main sort of contextual points I'd like to make. So the first one is that in a regional sense, you could say that Thailand, at an earlier point, achieved a higher level, a higher income status. So in 2011, according to World Bank figures, let's be specific there, it achieved upper middle income status, and that has been the first country in the region. At the same time, as Micah mentioned, there has also been a significant reduction in poverty at a national level, the lowest level in the region. However, there's been a lot of work and a lot of comment on the fact that there's a risk of middle income stagnation. This is the but. And we can look at certain issues contributing to that, such as a low wage and low tax regime, being reliant on labour-intensive and export development model. Perhaps you can talk about a lack of investment into education in the country, an inability to fully transfer out of resource exploitation, and there's still a prevalence of monopolistic power structures inhibiting competition, if you really want to think of it in purely economic terms. Now, even if we talk about a low level of poverty, actually, if we think of poverty in relational terms, then Thailand has one of the highest income inequalities, with a high Gini index, 37.9 in 2014. There are different measures around, and I know at some point there was a newspaper article that of one measure of inequality, Thailand was actually seen to reach the top of the tree, overtaking India and Russia on the inequality scales. So within the country, in economic terms, there is a great disparity between the less wealthy and the wealthiest. This, in a way, this slide echoes what Mike was talking about, is that if we were to trace this poverty, we could trace it into rural communities, rural and, in the case of Thailand, periphery areas of Thailand, which could be linked to accessibility, remoteness, in the case of the south, ongoing conflict. As well as rural, that also links into where we see the greatest prevalence of agriculture, also reaching into peripheral areas. The second point I would like to make is Thailand is also an aging population, where now 1/3 of the country are now 45 years old. I would speculate there's an increasing reliance on regional migrant labour. And in a way, Thailand is actually on track to become, you could class it as the first country to achieve rapid aging, yet without reaching a high income status. And without and I wouldn't necessarily know this, but its precise implications, but there could be certain, there will be definite new outcomes from such a process. As linking to this second issue, and echoing what Mike said a little earlier, Thailand is also an urbanizing population. It was shown earlier on the chart that it's 92% of the population in urban areas. And this is much higher than other Mekong countries, but it's also above the global average. The absolute figure for rural areas is also decreasing, so it's not just a relative increase in urban areas. And what we really have to see here is, especially younger generation, looking towards alternative occupation in. Sorry,
Can you turn on the microphone?
Turn off.
On.
Maybe you put it closer to your mouth.
One. Is this better? Apologies if you were missing some of the details there. Was there? I'll start again. Yeah, no. The urban world. So, yes, what we are seeing is an aging agricultural population. If not, there seems to be some contrast in narratives here, whereby on one hand, we've seen a lot of people supposedly selling up land, but on the other side, there's even within an aging agricultural population, there seem a lot of people who are really holding on to their land in the countryside.
So with this, I think we'll move more specifically on to the land question. I would like to highlight this map. I think it was a great opportunity to get access to some mapping as part of the Severe Mekong project, which is a joint project between NASA and USAID. Which originally it was a project set up, I think, for a support system for climate resilience and disaster preparedness. But I think even though it's quite small here, it is still viewable. I think there's some really good visual representation here of land use around the region and within each country. So we can really see sort of the sort of central plains and the main agricultural area, and then especially down the west side of the country, more mountainous and forest-covered areas. Now, this is where I want to start bringing in this notion of stability with a question mark. And this can apply to many features of land in Thailand. Are we looking at a stability in land use? If we look at a sectoral economic perspective, when we look at agriculture, suddenly it's back in the 1960s and 70s that the sector was commercialized and there was a great expansion in land use. If we look here, in terms of the output, as a proportion of GDP, it's remained relatively consistent over the last 10 years. At the 2015 figure was 8.3 of GDP. And as Micah alluded to earlier, but nevertheless retaining a much higher percentage of the population involved in the sector. And I put here 29.5% of the employed population working in agriculture. Similarly, if we look at land use, it's compared to other countries, as we saw earlier, it's a much more stable figure in terms of agricultural land use and especially forestry. And I would also echo, I put here more specifically, when we look at forestry, actually according to World Bank figures, 24.3% of forests consists of tree plantations, such as rubber. So we have to be careful how we look at these figures. And exactly that only, say, a smaller proportion of 41% actually represents primary forest. Now, it's always worth kind of measuring these against and comparing to other ways, other measurements of land use. When we look at forestry and we look at forest cover, it's important to recognize how a vast proportion of that is protected forest, and then 36% is national forest reserve. And there is a very developed system set up for protected areas in Thailand, including national parks and forest parks and wildlife conservation areas and no hunting areas and botanical gardens and so forth. So there's quite a developed system set up here. However, I think equally important is to consider the fact that, in a way, all land that is not private, because 40% of land in Thailand is carrying a private title, is recognized as state-owned forest land, whether that actually is achieved forest cover or not. Forest cover is about 32%, but state-owned forest land stands at 40%, and private land is 60%, my mistake. And I think a lot of conflicts and a lot of stories that I think people in this room will carry with them are around conflicts around all these different kind of boundaries, contestations around boundaries for forest, for state land, for conserved areas. And as, again, coming back, building on what Micah said earlier, the rights of those living within such areas that have now been deemed forest areas or national parks have become extremely problematic. And I think as an example, we can think of the extensive reclamations that took place in 2014 and 16. I do want to quickly mention that we were using an FAO project to gain data on land degradation around the region, and each country, a map was provided for each country. I think this represents a really good starting point to look at degradation. As you can see, you know, in terms of the pixelated form, these cover large areas. So they're not so detailed as to look at land degradation in localized levels around Thailand. However, there are some very interesting observations to be taken. There's two measurements showed in these colors. One is the present state, from low to high degradation, and the second one is the trend, you could say, as in it's in a process of becoming of achieving degradation, or perhaps even improving. So I think the red, or the dark red, red color represents the negative on both sides. It's highly degraded and it's getting worse. And you see this achieved especially around sort of central areas. Then the lighter red, pink color is more, actually it's not so degraded at the moment, but the trend is to become more highly degraded in the future. And I think this kind of data, when we think in terms of land use, commercialized agriculture, is something that could be very useful and very important, especially as the technology develops and we can get more precise information on it. I think Mike has said some very important things on boom crops and crop use around the region. The only thing I would like to add is that for the case of Thailand, more than other countries, Thailand has really become fully integrated into global value chains. So it is the second highest exporter of rice in the planet. It is the highest exporter of rubber. It is, through growing maize, it is the highest exporter of chicken products, with maize grown to provide animal feed. So it's high. The production system is highly integrated into these global trade networks. I think I'm slightly over time, but we'll get there. The other idea of potential stability I would like to talk about is the smallholder, especially in terms of Thailand. I think Jonathan Rigg came up with the phrase, the persistence of the smallholder. There are 5.9 million land holdings in Thailand, and nearly 3.4 million households possess a single parcel, which I think is a very high figure. When we ask why is the case that despite this high commercialization of the agricultural sector, why is it that smallholders still persist, even within a rubber sector, even within an oil palm sector? In one level, a historical perspective is needed, which looks at the smallholders' role at the times of extraterritorialism, authorialization, but also through the time of the threat of communist insurgency into Thailand. The smallholder ended up playing a vital role together with the state in terms to kind of protect state interests. And so that role became enshrined then also through legal policy. Nevertheless, in a policy forum, the commercialization and yield does still predominate or dominate over the livelihoods of these smallholders. We perhaps have seen in recent years a greater direction towards the commercial side. The Pracharat policy, I think, has really been looking towards public-private people partnerships, with, I think, the private taking precedence. We're looking towards border zones as areas of potential development of commercialized agriculture. And I think the recent setting up of 10 special economic zones is a very good image of that, regardless of how many of those 10 zones actually end up being used. Finally, it's important within the narrative of land concessions also to recognize that foreign investment setting up land concessions hasn't really taken place in Thailand. Instead, Thailand has taken a role as a foreign investor itself, whether it's involved in sugarcane in Cambodia or in other countries as well. I think Mike, won't spend long on this. Micah spoke at length a little bit about inequality. We have Ajahn Duangmani from Thammasat University, who kind of was a forerunner, did some really important work on land and inequality. For this study, we looked at more specifically at agricultural land and used the 2013 agricultural census. And in a way, although we see kind of a higher level in the central area where there's a sort of a legacy of high degrees of tenancy and a kind of a higher concentration of holdings, actually the level of land inequality for agriculture is perhaps not drastically worse than other countries around the region, and potentially could be more representative of the idea of the smallholder still having a role in the country. Again, stability, if we want to talk about stability, we can talk about stability and longevity in legal framework and policy, and that stretches back over 100 years from the land law in 2001. The present titling system remains from the Land Code in 1954. So, unlike other countries, which many of them are still undergoing legal revisions, Thailand does have kind of that legacy to build upon. Two areas quickly to mention before wrapping up that are in a way very important for MRLG, and it's very interesting to see how they fit into a Thai context. First one is customary tenure. In a certain way, in the Thai context, it's kind of notable by its absence. It's not really how people talk about land or the main discussions on land in Thailand. In a certain way, you could talk about a dominance of state systems, including land reform programs, wanting to then take control of providing land for poor or providing temporary land leases, say, for people living in forest areas. However, you could equally talk about a sort of disproportionate impact of land policies on ethnic minority groups who already lack full citizenship rights. There have been various community-based tenure systems of which people in the room have been involved, and RCSD was involved, for example, in lobbying for community forestry rights, lobbying for land titling rights, and there has been sort of centralized, there was the community forestry bill, passed but not enacted, update in a moment, and there has been community land titling policy, first in 2011, and then by the Koto Cho scheme under the junta. However, these could be said to represent more centralized control mechanisms rather than fully catering to the kind of the demands and the community needs that have been put forward. Finally, the other point, gender. Theoretically, statutory law in Thailand offers equal rights to men and women. However, it could be argued that with households commonly registered under a male household head, that there is a sort of a control monopolization away from women. Despite that, if you look at the agricultural censi over the past, 20 years, you do see a great increase in the number of female agricultural landowners from 15.4% to 36.3% in 2013, and that is in absolute numbers as well as proportion. I think one of the major gaps which actually I found really hard to fill, and any information, please come and talk to me. I really find it very hard to find any information on the status of joint titling, conjugal titling. So this would certainly be something to follow up further in the future. Now, this is very much the kind of information I wanted to talk about that is contained within the chapter. Of course, this is not something that stands still. So there are many, and this could be maybe a platform for further discussion in the questions. Emerging issues. Obviously, Thailand now has a new government, per se. And so we're in a very dynamic moment. What will happen next, I think, is on the question on many people's lips. Just the other day, Peter Lim Charunrat from Future Forward Party, in a speech, I think, put forward land tenure security as one of the core issues for agriculture and for poverty in rural areas. So it'll be very interesting to see, it was very interesting to see that put out in the public domain. Will that be followed up? Just before the new government took place, there's been a whole series of new laws, legal revisions put forward, from the National Parks Law, Wildlife Preservation Protection Act, Community Forestry Bill, actually enacted, National Land Policy Committee Act, Land and Buildings Tax a little earlier. I think there's many fears around these. There's many fears that they could limit access to people in forests, could be discriminatory and kind of result in punitive measures for people in these areas. There are also potential positives. So my reading so far, there's quite vague messages there, and it's really to see how are these going to actually play out in their implementation. I would be very interested to hear more views on these. And of course, recently there's been more upcoming concerns at an environmental level, whether it's been smog in the north, land encroachment and degradation. What we have here is often an urban voice joining in, sometimes supporting, often counter to maybe the voice of the farming community. But these things are kind of capturing more and more of a mainstream narrative and mainstream consciousness. So it'll be interesting to see how these develop and what sort of impacts they have upon demands for a land system within Thailand. So I will leave it there, and I think, yeah, as I say, I really will welcome, I put these down as very loose points, and I really do welcome further comments on them as we go later into questions. Thank you very much.
Next up is our discussant, Jan Chusakwatayapak from CMU, who will try to kind of synthesize the discussion.
I will give a kind of reflections on the land issue in Thailand case and respond to what Daniel just presented. I think this morning, if you listen to what Dr. Maika has presented, the overviews of the land issue in the Mekong regions, one striking fact that has been highlighted in the case of Thailand is that Thailand has a declining rural population, but it's still roughly 1/3 live in the rural area. And when you look at the poor, 80% are from that rural areas. So this kind of gives you some picture where poverty in Thailand and how it related to ruralities, agriculture, land issues, and of course the inequality issue that Thailand has been mentioned in many reports, from Oxfam, from the World Economic Forums, the top 3 or even taken over of Russia and India. So that's kind of major fact that's informed about Thailand inequalities. And of course, I think Ajahn Yongmani have done an excellent research and try to link the problem of inequality and land issue in Thailand. This is a well publicized in Thailand, I think, in the case of the problem of inequalities. I think after election, I think just before the new government taking the powers, there's some small controversial news that reported about the Deputy Prime Minister, General Pravit, has used a luxury jet from the National Police Force to go to give the land titles back to the villagers who are the victim of the what they call loan shark, the illegal lenders. And it's become a new, this is kind of highlight the successful of this coup-appointed government in terms of addressing the injustice, the inequality in Thailand. At the same time, there's another report. 14 villagers in Chayapum has been sentenced to in the prison term ranging from maybe 4 months to 10 years of land encroachment in the national parks. So this kind of contrasting pictures. The first one is kind of highlight how the governments handle this kind of land issue. They think this is the problem of people losing land is kind of more like an individual case, because of the law enforcement or some malfunction of the law or so the government try to help in terms of get the land back and get rid of that kind of high interest land loan monies. But the second case is more like a kind of structural problems, right? Which has been in Thailand for many, many years about people who live in the forest. So my point here is that try to zoom where these poor people are and what are their problems. And it's clearly that it is more about the land issues and the farmers, So I start my thinking about this reflection by looking at historical background of Thailand in terms of how Thai modern nation state has territorialized their territory and internal territorialization about land and forest. Right? The first is, before I go into that detail, I think the issue of land and forest in Thailand is inseparable. I think you need to look at this a kind of thing that go together as a parallel. You either become a landless or a farmer who rents the land from a private owner, or you become a land encroacher, become a forest encroacher. So if you look at the whole area of Thailand, there's only two kind of space or territory. One is forest, right? Through this process of territorialization or the nationalization of forests, to become a state property. If you look at the definition of forest in Thai law, is that forest is land that no one owns through the land code. So it can be a swamp, it can be a treeless land, that's forest. Unless you get some document to prove that you own the land from the land code. There's no empty space. So the problem that I mentioned is that where these poor are, where they are in the middle, in the edge of this forest and lands, in the legal term, right? You either, if you are poor, you either landless farmer renting the land, from the private owners, or you encroach in the state forest land, like in the second case that I mentioned. Government tend to take care this issue in the system, right? Because Thai land court has well established a long time, right? So they think this is nothing wrong. It's just kind of a case that some law enforcement is not function well, so they are willing to take care in terms of, take the land title back from the loan shark and give back to the farmer, and then it's sold, and this become the government's publicity. So through this kind of forest territorialization, which come with during the process of making modern Thai nation state, that's the King Rama V tried to make to map Thailand, and start to demarcate the forest. And after that, there's a series of activities that the government used to manage forests. First with kind of product control, and then start to use the territorialization or control of space, and lately use scientific criteria to classify forests into protected areas, national parks, or wildlife conservation. Of course, this has been conflict with the local people who traditionally use the forest in their livelihoods. There has been a movement of community forest movement for almost more than 30 years through the mobilization of the people in the rural areas living in the forest to try to push it into the laws. In terms of lands, it's clearly that is through territorialization process, land has been privatized. It's the evolution is dated back to, mostly people would mention it start with the Thailand signed the Bowring Treaty with the British, to open rice markets. And then they start to have a kind of land disputes around Bangkok areas, and that led government to adopt the kind of private property on lands and start to have a land tithing program and later on come up with the help from the World Bank to accelerate the land tithing program, shorten the time from probably take 200 years to complete to 20 years, to complete land tithing programs. Of course, later on, I think there's a lot of research that point out that through that process, of course, land markets is really rich in Thailand, but small-scale farmers tend to lose their land by accident or by, involved in some unfortunate situation. They have to mortgage their lands, cannot return the money, and they lost it. So this is a problem that shaped the issue of land in Thailand. A land tithing program in Thailand, I think, is one of really top example of the successful case in the eye of the World Banks. When World Bank go into the country that start the reform, especially in the region as after the post-socialist economic reform has taking place in Laos, in Vietnam. Thailand always the case that World Bank refer to as a successful, but this land tithing program, there's a two sides of the coin, successful in terms of economic performance, in terms of support economic growth in Thailand, but in another side is also lead to conflicts in every level of social setting, even among the family member, right? The conflict between the legal rights on land and traditional rights lead to conflict within the families, the household. Ajahn wrote a very good article on this. You can see that in some really rich family, they just kill each other, right? Because of the arguments or the conflict about the lands, that's used to inherit through the women, the daughters, and the son make legal claim and take it to the court. So this is what happens in terms of land tithing programs. But the interesting thing is that this kind of shift is kind of divert attention of the policymaker when we discuss about land reform. Right? During the 70s, we would talking about the redistribution of lands, the policy that for land to the tiller, right? So that's the emphasis. But through this tithing program of privatization of lands, when talking about land reform, is tend to emphasize on the clarification of property right or privatization of lands, instead of equal distribution of lands. That kind of agenda has kind of disappeared. So this leads to the lack of attention to the problem of inequalities and polarizations. and also the impoverishment of some group, of a specific group of people that's already marginalized, like the ethnic minorities, people who live in the forest. And this problem also lead to an emergence of the people movement in terms of community land reform. Later on, focus on the community land titles movement. So, as I mentioned earlier, that we cannot separate land and forest issues, because you either in the forest or in the lands or private lands. There's no in between. There's no empty space there. But these poor people are the ones that struggle in this between space. As I quote one of the land rights activists here that mentioned that main cause of deforestation is inequality in society. Is this about inequality in land ownership and distribution? So this is kind of well connect between the problem of deforestation or forest encroachment and the issue of lands. Some people may look at this as small issues. Because if we look at the overview of Thailand development in the past 40 years, there's a story of successful, in terms of poverty reduction from 70% in the early 60s to now it's 70% or something, people who live under poverty. That has been highlighted by the mainstream policymakers. But when you look at the poor, who are struggling in their everyday life, the land issue is a representation of their struggles. In striving for equal rights in society, not only land, but in every aspect of Thai society, in political rights, in development rights. But for some people, when they look at another side of Thailand, that's the continued growth, industrializations, become the upper middle income countries. They tend to think that, to dismiss that, land and agriculture is not a problem. It's not relevant because agriculture sector in Thailand is declining. Labor force in agriculture is declining. And people are engaged in non-agricultural employment. Look at the GDP, the agricultural products contribute not much, compared with industry and service. But this picture is kind of hiding or obscures this a pocket of poor people who are farmers, have no land, and intend to live in the rural area and continue their farming livelihoods. And this kind of idea would further marginalize these people to fall into a deep poverty without good attention from the policymakers, because they still just think that land issue is just it's not a kind of systemic problem or structural problem. It's kind of individual case. If people are cheated by the loan shark, they can help to get land back. So the problem will not go away, as long as we still have this kind of poor people, landless. So we can see from the movements, the community land title movements, try to organize with the people and try to submit the problem to the government. Every time when there's a new government into powers, when the coup government into powers, in these post-election governments, this not only the kind of problem of this group of people, but I think it also represents the kind of growing oppositions to the dominance of the big corporate agribusiness in agricultural products and also land acquisitions. It's also represent a kind of new agrarian movement that still mobilize around the single class base of the poor farmer or the landless peoples who were exploited by the corporate capitals. These new agrarian movements still attempt to continue the vision of farming society, farming communities, with the new condition of the hegemony of neoliberals, globalizations. There's many small cases like special economic zone that mentioned in the report that lead to the movement of the peoples, or the movement of people against the Eastern Economic Corridor in terms of the permission that allow the private sector to lease the land for up to 99 years. So all this still prop up into Thai public attentions, as long as this problem has not structurally taken care of in terms of the institutional framework that underlie the right of the people. I think I did this.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Chusak. We have about maybe 15, 20 minutes for some Q&A. How would you like to do this, Daniel? Should we take maybe a bundle of questions at a time for the speakers? Yeah, so maybe we'll take 2 or 3 to start with. The floor is open for anyone to ask questions. Yeah. Ashley, did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, just to get things started, thanks. I'm Ashley South. Very, very interesting, and I'm, of course, looking forward to reading this beautiful book. I think I've mostly worked on Myanmar, Burma, in the region, And certainly in Burma, I think land is like the mother of all cross-cutting issues. So it's good to then have this kind of regional view to put it all in context. It's just like one real small comment really, but like working on Burma, so much of discussion and issues, policies, struggles around land, it's connected to conflict, and of course conflict is everywhere, and that's been said this morning in different ways. So in Myanmar, it's particularly around armed conflict between ethnic armed organizations, other groups, and the military and government. And I was kind of struck, and this is the question, I suppose, for the other countries in the region. It seems that like armed conflict, it maybe was something that very connected to land issues 20 years ago. There was some mention of the communist insurgency in Thailand, the whole Indo-Chinese wars. But in Myanmar, land and conflict still really are connected, and it comes into IDP and refugee issues, talking about federalism, peace process to try and reimagine state-society relations. So that's why it's like this cross-cutting issue. And is that something now that is kind of unique to Myanmar? I mean, conflict is everywhere, but the relationship between land and armed conflict seems to be mostly relevant more in Myanmar than other parts of the region. But if that's right, I guess, is there any lessons, positive or negative, from how armed conflicts were resolved in other parts of the region, and how that related to land, maybe resettlement of communities, etc., after conflict, that can be useful for how Myanmar can try and address land issues in its multifarious different contexts, different conflicts, sorry. So I guess, yeah, land and conflict and post-conflict and lessons learned from the region for Myanmar particularly.
Okay, so that's going to be a general question for everyone.
/ general question. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with that. Maybe we'll take one or two more, just so the speakers can take note of those. Any other ones?
Actually, I'm afraid I'm not this on or no. Yes? No? Not really, no. Sort of semi-on. I speak loudly. There's probably no point, actually. I'm not sure that I will have a very satisfying response to it. I think only to, well, I guess 2 points. One being that for certain the distribution of land and control and access to land, is that loud enough for people? No. We're certainly at the heart of the Indo-Chinese conflicts. I think both at sort of macro scale in terms of conflict over control of territory and land in a larger sense between colonial powers and national populist movements and such. I think that the resolution of those, and certainly the aftermath of those conflicts, very much had to do with the redistribution of land. Again, as Professor Chusak mentioned about the land to tiller movements and things, which were very much the prompt for a lot of the conflicts, and also sort of the tool by which those were resolved in a certain way. I think the other thing, so yes, I said there are incidents of armed conflict in smaller scale. So still in Laos, there's an insurgency, a small but still present insurgency in the northeastern parts of Laos. But yeah, I think at the moment, of course, armed conflict is really more a unique feature of Myanmar. What I would say, though, I think on the opposite of that is that often the absence of conflict doesn't, of course, mean the absence of the issues that would normally trigger conflicts. And I think what's interesting in some ways is that the armed conflict in Myanmar, and not trying to put any kind of like a positive silver lining on it, but one aspect of it is it does keep alive a lot of these current debates and allows for certain kind of spaces to talk about. I think one of the things we did not highlight in this, which I think is interesting in talking about land titling coverage in Myanmar, is that the territories controlled by the KNU have issued more than 40,000 land titles under their administrative zones. And I think
70, 80,000.
now, yeah, okay. So I think what's interesting about that is that it was, in some ways this sort of state, non-state tension allowed for different ways of handling and trying to deal with the land issue. And not now trying to make a comparison between the central state's handling of titling and tenure security and other issues and the KNUs, but I think there are reasons to point out that the Karen National Union actually has handled some things much better, I think, than the central government when it comes to things like recognition of customary tenure, collective decision-making with respect to land. I think absent of the armed conflict, or at least the prospects of state and non-state powers having existing intention, I think, couldn't happen. So that probably isn't very satisfying. I think it's maybe something to it.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. This is a very interesting meeting. I'm sorry I came in a bit late, so I don't know whether I missed out some few points being presented by the early presenters. My name is Tina, and I've been following more on the convention, the policy side. So it's great to be coming here and looking at this report, which is great. So I haven't had a really look at it. But it's fantastic. But I just wanted to know that for me, the book, the publication seems to be more like an assessment or our assessment of the region of what the status of land is, and looking at so-called maybe an emerging trend. But looking at, I suppose you will see that in the second part, and what Achan also talked about, the challenges. I don't know whether it is there, but does this book also build upon maybe coming up with some strategic recommendations, what might need to be done of securing land tenure, of looking at a gender dimension, because it does mention in your briefing note, and there is a recognition of what the gaps are. So this could be great, like for my reference, to use as policy of an assessment. But I don't know whether it's a reflection of those recommendations. This also I'm saying is that I don't follow the issue of land directly, but I do on forest and biodiversity, and they're very interlinked. You also, this is a fantastic book to also kind of contribute to the global outlook on land that usually comes out by the convention UNCCD, and they have a meeting upcoming in September. This would have been fabulous to showcase it there.
So with respect to the first question, yes, this was explicitly an assessment, not a recommendation set. So we discussed this at the beginning when we put this together. I think, in keeping with the nature of these state of type reports, we were trying to sort of look at the current status and trends to now. And I think using the evidence and the data provided there as a basis upon which recommendations could be built, but we intentionally kind of set the groundwork for it, but intentionally didn't go that far. And I think partly because we saw this as being something that could then emerge or build upon what we've done with the state of land so far. For certain, those are definitely needed, but I think that's kind of, it's an implicit question of today as well. I mean, in some sense, they, like framing it as a launch, it's a launch of this book itself. But more, it's kind of a launch of now, where do we go from here? It would be interesting to talk further about that. I think with the global land outlook, in some ways, I think so CDE, our institution, is also involved in that, and we will also be at the COP in India next week, I think, right? I personally won't be going, but others of ours who are working on the land sector more generally. And this is something that we've had in our mind, and I think for many of us, the global land outlook was a little bit unsatisfying in some respects because it very carefully avoids the political economy questions, I think. So it really kind of tends to dwell very comfortably within the sort of biophysical elements and socioeconomic. And I think that's probably the biggest gap with all of these kinds of state of reports, is that it's necessary. I think the main issues we're dealing with are questions of political economy, yet those are the most difficult to engage with. And I think also with a view to trying to keep lots of different kind of stakeholders at the table and on board with these discussions. Here also, I think maybe going back to the armed conflict question, is that we had to grapple with a lot of important questions upon which we had to remain somewhat silent, I think, when it came to this, to avoid burning down bridges that we wanted to try to keep open, and yet trying to be honest to what's actually happening. I think that's kind of a fine line across the world anyway, but especially this region, I think.
Yeah, a very short response to this is that even though the book does not enter into recommendation, an implicit one that is there is about transparency of data that is missing in many countries, and it's the building of a book like this has been an extremely complex endeavor. Why? Because data is not readily available from governments, and there are big questions about the quality of the data also that governments, when they share something, and there is a lot of work behind it to look at whether the data is correct. So that's I think was also one of the key objectives of this.
Just while you're on the data discussion, I was just wondering whether there's been sort of efforts to link the data coming out on regional level or country level to these sort of global type land data hubs that are now proliferating, and whether there's any value on that, or whether it's just kind of a waste of time, whether there's any value in that.
There has been parts. So I think this particular product is part of, it overlaps with several different sort of streams of work that are being carried out. So for example, the land concession data that's presented in this book, the data that is presented for Laos specifically, this is the first publication of that information. In the program that we use to develop that data, that is then currently it's still working with the government of Laos, but ultimately the idea is to have that linked then to the land matrix. I think one thing on this point, maybe not asking a question, but reflecting to it, is that the past 3 years or 4 years, there's been a proliferation, might be an understatement, an explosion, I'd say, of different sort of dashboards and tracking tools and all kinds of things. It's probably a separate discussion, but I think there would be a lot of value in us, sort of those of us working on the sector in this region, to get together and try to get our heads around all the diversity of ones that are available and which ones are most. It should be a priority, I think, in terms of reporting, to avoid duplication of reporting and such. I think one good one is Landex, which has recently come out, which would be a good one, but there were parallel ones also dealing with other aspects of things like land governance. Which then I think probably more specifically to your question, the governance assessment will be used to inform the country-level reporting for Landex, insofar as we can use it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm an anthropologist, and I listened for your good presentation this morning with interest. And then I think there's a passing mentioning about traditional or cultural meaning of land, especially specifically the question of whose land is it, traditionally and culturally, in terms of gender. But there is no mentioning of in-depth study in terms of what you presented so far. There is in passing of this. Recently, I came from Isan and to live here, and I went to one ethnic group, specifically 21 households. They decided to live in the forest, with the forest, on the forest, protecting the forest, and especially the young ladies. I questioned them on why not men, or some, but they go off to cities, education and work and so on and so forth. But then, one time, I stayed long enough, and one household, they said, oh, we would preparing something now. We don't really have much time to talk to you. Oh, where are you going? Oh, we have to spend 3 more days in my household, my mother's household. This is the lady family. I said, could I go and observe whatever you will be doing? Say, oh, no, you're a man. You're outsider. Not even my husband, not even my son-in-laws can attend this ritual. What kind of ritual? It's worshiping the spirits of the female side of the family, of the kinship thing. So I did not have time to follow whether or not that relates to why these young women, really decided to live off the land, with the land, and protecting the land. So this is only one aspect of ethnic group here. They don't live too far from the city, but they have chosen to do that. So I would suspect that if you look deeply into this area, perhaps you would gain some insight to Ajahn Chusak's last slide mentioning about a trend that in Thailand, if I listen enough, carefully enough, that there's a trend of people in different specifically said, which side of the gender, whether men more than women or women more than men, who have chosen not to go to the other advanced life, but have chosen to live off the land. So I suspect that maybe, again, if there is some studies, we may learn that those would be young female or, that kind of thing. I don't know. So this is the question that I think I gained from listening and from looking further if I have a chance to be closer to these people and try to kind of understand the situation in relationship with the land issue that you, I think, present very interesting and very helpful to me. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Does anyone want to tackle the gender dimension that John's speaking about? Or okay, yeah, then.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Surya. Just a very quick comment, reflection. I mean, I guess this was not the aim of the book to provide that kind of frame, looking at, say, local knowledge systems and how this plays out on the ground within local communities. I think what I would hope is that potentially this book could offer a reference point, a wider framework, which then could be applied or help these deeper studies. So if it was able to do that, I would be very happy if it would be taken on that way. But I don't think within the context of the book itself it was to really dive into that level.
If you look at the last section of the book, actually we explicitly engaged with this and say one of the key informational gaps, apart from the obvious issues with the sort of official data, et cetera, was this non-representation of local or indigenous knowledge and information. I think, in my view, but I think also just more generally, it's recognized that one of the big issues we deal with is that in the Mekong region and the world, there's a huge amount of vast resource of knowledge and information that remains largely inaccessible to sort of the scientific community or governments and things like that. There are several different dimensions to that. One dimension, of course, being spiritual values and gender. I think it's sort of a resounding gap. So no, we did not engage with it, but we explicitly pointed out that this was an aspect that we felt needs further engagement, but wasn't possible within the context of this. So anyway, just to say that we heartily agree. And I think also science needs better tools by which it can engage with, and I think society in general needs to have better discussions about how we see the legitimacy of alternative ways of knowing things, including traditional and indigenous knowledge.
If I may, if there's no other, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I would like to kind of follow up on Micah's point about indigenous or local knowledge, and maybe ask everyone who's been involved in the project, what were some of the challenges that were entailed by trying to reflect on this problem or this issue of how to incorporate within your methodology indigenous, relational ontology, spiritual cosmologies into this kind of grand kind of overview of land relations in the region? What are some of the steps, I guess, at a practical level need to be done if you were to incorporate such knowledges in the future? So that would be one question, if I may. The second one has to do in terms of, again, to ask you about the challenges in putting together a book that is, I haven't read it, but I look forward to reading it, but is largely its status in terms of thematic. So I'd maybe ask you guys to reflect on what that helps us see, but more so what does that prevent us from seeing in regards to land relations. And I'm thinking particularly here about the transboundary element of land governance and land relations, and the question of flows in investment, in financing. Some of the speakers touched upon this in terms of the role of China, and I'd just like to get your thoughts collectively on some of these questions. Thank you.
I have a question about the chapter on Thailand that you classified about rural populations, and how do you define the rural area? For example, a graphic on page 139, not 48, seems you get the source from the housing and population census in 2010. And I gave the data is based on how they divide within the municipality or outside the municipality, which I think is not what we say the globally.
Yeah, it's entirely up to to you which one to go with that.
This was a problematic decision. On one level, and this is where you kind of come up against kind of inconsistency in data sets between different departments. There's quite established national level kind of figure for urban against rural, which is kind of 52%. When it comes to breaking it down into a subnational level, that particular figure isn't done. And the only subnational form I could find was municipal, non-municipal. Now, what I realize is that this carries questions in itself in terms of, is this a sufficient kind of boundary to place in terms of classification of rural and urban? I think with a lack of any other subnational statistics that I could actually find, I guess you could call it a sort of proxy. So I accept the fact that it could be questioned, is this a realistic form for the urban, non-urban? But in order to provide some sort of reference point at a subnational level, that was, for me, the best thing I could find. I take the question on completely.
And how the other countries classify urban and rural? So for comparison, we have like different definition or different classification. It will be difficult to compare.
Yeah, no, it's very difficult to compare. And I think probably your question, I could make it worse too, because this same question doesn't pertain only to measures of rurality versus urban, but also definitions of agricultural households. So an agricultural household is one in which agriculture is the main source of income, or is it a household that engages in agriculture? In all of these kinds of measures, they are non-standard, so they vary across all the countries. With urban versus rural, I think Laos is an unusual case in that urban is actually defined by things like housing conditions and road access, which I think by other measures in other parts of the world is fairly strange in some ways, in that we tend to use more like population density or something like this. I think this is just a common problem you have with any data when you're trying to do something like a standardization of data for the purpose of comparison or assessment. So yeah, for sure. There's even to forest, for example, definitions of forest is really all over the place. And in my personal view, defining a rubber plantation as a forest is, of course, nonsense from an ecological standpoint. But we have what we have to work with, basically. So yeah, please, if you want to pick apart the things, there's lots of things that can be picked apart very happily. But I think still we try to kind of find a center point upon which we can build a reference. Yeah. I think going back to your question, Bobby, thanks for the abstraction. I think in the context of this, we dodged a bullet in some ways. That's not the right way to say it. We intentionally avoided trying to bring together things like traditional and ecological indigenous knowledge with the kind of formal data sets. And I think the main issue that we had here was, again, the intention of this book is trying to reach several different audiences. the main problem we have with traditional indigenous knowledge is that it simply is not seen as legitimate knowledge by a large part of society, especially government agencies in general, not as private individuals, but as institutions. You know, the sort of scientific community, capital S scientific community, in large part doesn't also recognize this. You have people, of course, political ecologists and anthropologists and others who have well recognized this, but so far we've had a very difficult battle, I think, trying to demonstrate the legitimacy of these kinds of knowledge. And I think for me it's more that's an emerging area that I think, like several different kinds of epistemological questions, certain disciplines have handled this and been handling it for a long time, whereas in the larger sort of discourses on science and understanding knowledge, it still remains largely, I think, a peripheral issue, sort of a hobby issue of anthropologists and political ecologists and others. And I think answering the question is something a lot larger than what we do in State of Land, but how do we as knowledge developers and knowledge brokers or whatever engage with this in a better way? And I think right now it's a major failing probably, I think, of how we're handling things. I mean, just quite quickly, I think personally, my first coming to Laos in 2005, I think what I was faced with was a place where, coming as an agroecologist, but working in communities where a large part of the population couldn't write their name, but yet could identify more than 1,000 species of plants and their uses and other things they know about them, which I think was a very stark realization for me, in that there's a huge body of knowledge that exists all across this region and the world, but we simply don't know how to tap it effectively.
We're running kind of a bit over time here. Stomachs might be rumbling. Maybe a final question if there's any. If not, we can continue. Oh, yeah, sorry, Antoine, if you want.
I have half a question, half a remark that might lead to future research also related to the state of land. My impression listening to the speakers and looking at the book is I still have problems with the way we treat poverty as something that is in rural area, in forest area, that is connected to indigenous people, and which seems in a way very static. And my experience of rural areas, and especially where there are poverty, is that it's extremely dynamic. And it's very much connected in this time to migration. And there are some parts where migration is mentioned into the book, but it's not a topic that is really dealt with. And when you have the regional perspective, in my view, it becomes even more important to deal about migration. So, you know, I've working in Cambodia, in Myanmar, I've seen that poverty, especially in areas which are isolated, is often overestimated because the way resources are managed are so different from lowland areas that there is difficulties in the way poverty is approached. And when you look at poverty in lowland areas, it's often very more telling to look whether the places have received poverty, poor are coming, or whether it's a place where poor are leaving the areas. So we know the cycle of indebtedness, that people losing land and then moving. And I remember some studies early 2000 in Cambodia which were showing areas where statistically they were not too much poor, but they were impoverishment. And many people were leaving those rural areas because there was no resource available and going to the cities because of losing their land and their livelihoods, basically. We see something similar in the Delta in Myanmar, for example, where there has been a high proportion of poor there, and that's true, and that's still true today, but a high migration that has started as livelihoods collapse. Basically, the fishing that were one of the key resources for many of the poor communities collapsed. And that has largely fed a migration movement. That's not the only cause of it, it's much more complex than that. But I just wanted to bring this question on how do you deal with migration and how do you see migration being better integrated in the future in this book?
There's a fair amount of on migration actually, especially in the Cambodian chapter, somewhat. I think, in part it's just having to select those kind of topics you dealt with, but I think the major issue with migration we have is a lack of data to work with. So one of the things is we tried to rely heavily upon standardized data that was accessible, that could be compared across dimensions and things like that. The issue you have with migration is so IOM does some amount of work on this. There's a very good study done in Thailand actually, and migrants in Thailand, their origins and such, and we reflected that in the book. Apart from that, there aren't really good ways of getting at migration data. You can do some through international migrations, but internal migrations are difficult. Censuses don't tend to capture them very well because censuses tend to focus on your official point of registry or residence, whereas a lot of migrations are temporary. So where a migration is a long-term migration, meaning a move from one place to another, it's somewhat easier to get at. But a lot of migration we see are labor migrations that are seasonal in nature, and those are very difficult to get at, apart from a few case studies here and there, which is quite difficult to use to make comparisons. So I think for sure it's one of the many topics that could be quite relevant for a thematic focus more on in the next, whatever we do with this. But also I think, there's some I think clever thinking would have to be done about how we get at this through available data. I think it does bring up, sorry, Bob, your other question that I didn't respond to about this flows and things. Look in the regional chapter, there's quite a bit actually about flows of capital and also flows of resources. But I think one of the things that became apparent to us is that historically, especially in these kind of state of things, we tend to focus on territories, whereas I think the world is becoming much more of a flow-based world rather than a territorial-based world. And I think Thailand is a wonderful example of that, of a country that's in the global arena is not a very large country, but yet is a giant when it comes to some of these major flows of especially agricultural products. I think probably we'll see more of that. I think more governance in the future will have more and more to do with the governance of flows of resources and people and finances and other things, and probably less to do with the governance of territory as such. Yeah.
That's quite a nice way to kind of to finish off, I think. Lead into lunch if there's, I think, no more questions. Daniel, do you want to have a few closing words or remarks?
Just lunch.
Lunch.
It's
okay. So maybe
prioritized comment. There will be a lunch provided. I think if we go downstairs to
in the glass room, no? Follow your noses, perhaps? Or
follow the stream of people, and we will find lunch together.
Okay, if you could then just join me to thank the speakers for a very interesting discussion.
And then we will start up again. We're going to start again at 1:10 past.